The dispatch arrives on a Tuesday morning in July. The clerk carries it down the marble corridor of the Foreign Office in London, his footsteps echoing in the summer heat. He hands it to the secretary, who glances at the header, United States Department of State, and places it in the stack marked Americas. It sits there for 3 hours before anyone reads it. When Lord Salisbury finally breaks the seal that evening, he reads standing by the window, one hand holding the paper, the other resting on the sill. The language is dense, legalistic, running to thousands of words, but the core message is short enough. The United States government is demanding that Great Britain submit to arbitration over a border dispute in South America. A border dispute Britain has already settled years ago with maps and surveys and colonial administrators. The note does not ask, it lectures. It invokes a doctrine Britain does not recognize. It uses the word sovereign, not metaphorically, but legally, to describe American authority over an entire hemisphere. Salisbury sets the paper down and looks out at the Thames. He does not consider it urgent. This is the Venezuela Crisis of 1895. It begins not with gunfire, but with paper. It ends not with surrender, but with a quiet decision made in private rooms by men who understand that empires do not always fall. They step aside. What happens between those two moments is the story of how power transfers in the modern world, not through conquest, through calculation. By the summer of 1895, the British Empire spans 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. It controls the seas, the trade routes, the cable lines that carry information across oceans. It is the largest political entity in human history. From Cape Town to Calcutta, from Sydney to Singapore, the Union Jack flies over territories so vast that the sun, quite literally, does not set on them all at once. This dominance is not abstract. It is enforced by the Royal Navy, which operates more warships than the next 3 powers combined. It is financed by the City of London, where the world's capital flows through banks that fund railways in Argentina, mines in Australia, and plantations in Ceylon. British merchants control the insurance markets, the shipping schedules, the commodity exchanges. When a crisis erupts anywhere in the world, it is British diplomats who mediate, British gunboats that arrive, British terms that are accepted. The men who manage this system do so from a small cluster of buildings in Westminster and a smaller cluster of clubs in Pall Mall. They are aristocrats, many of them, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, trained to see the world as a chessboard where pieces are moved according to logic and tradition. They believe in hierarchy. They believe in patience. They believe, above all, in the permanence of British power. But across the Atlantic, something is changing. The United States has spent the last 30 years rebuilding after its Civil War and expanding westward across a continent. By 1895, that expansion is complete. The frontier is closed. The indigenous nations have been defeated or confined to reservations. The land has been divided, settled, farmed, mined, and connected by steel rail. What emerges from this process is not the agrarian republic of Thomas Jefferson's imagination. It is an industrial colossus. American steel production surpasses Britain's in 1886. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, Britain is no longer the workshop of the world. American coal output follows. American railroads carry more freight than all of Europe combined. The population is exploding. Immigrants arrive by the hundreds of thousands each year, filling factories in Pittsburgh and Chicago and New York. The economy grows so fast it becomes unstable, lurching from boom to panic and back again. The Depression of 1893 leaves millions unemployed. banks failing, businesses collapsing. Out of this instability comes frustration. The American public, particularly in the cities, begins to ask why their country, so powerful at home, remains so quiet abroad. There is a growing belief that the United States has earned a place among the great powers, that it should have influence beyond its borders, that it should be taken seriously. This sentiment has no single source. It is fed by newspapers, by politicians looking for distraction from domestic failure, by business interests seeking new markets, by veterans of the Civil War who remember British sympathy for the Confederacy. It is fed, too, by a simple fact. The energy that drove westward expansion has nowhere left to go. The Pacific coast has been reached. The next frontier, if there is to be one, must be outward. These two trajectories, British confidence and American ambition, do not collide immediately. They slide toward each other slowly, grinding along fault lines that have existed for decades. The point of contact is not strategic. It is not the Caribbean, though that matters. It is not about naval bases or trade routes, though those matter too. It is about a stretch of jungle in South America that most people cannot locate on a map. The dispute over the border between Venezuela and British Guiana is older than anyone involved. It begins in the early 19th century, when Britain acquires the colony from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. The Dutch never bothered to define the western boundary of their territory because the interior is worthless: dense rainforest, swamps, rivers choked with vegetation, heat that kills Europeans within weeks. There are no roads, no towns, no economic reason to care where one territory ends and another begins. But empires do not tolerate blank spaces. In 1841, the British government commissions a surveyor named Robert Schomburgk to map the colony. Schomburgk draws a line. It runs far to the west of the previous Dutch claims, extending British control to the Orinoco River Delta. This delta is the commercial gateway to Venezuela's interior. Schomburgk's line, if accepted, would give Britain control over Venezuela's primary trade artery. Venezuela protests. The government in Caracas points to old Spanish maps that show the border running much farther east along the Essequibo River. They argue that the British are inventing claims to territory that has been Venezuelan for centuries. Britain ignores them. Venezuela is weak, unstable, prone to coups and civil wars. It has no navy, no international allies, no leverage. The British government files the Venezuelan protests and moves on. The dispute simmers for 50 years. Diplomats exchange notes. Commissions are proposed and abandoned. Nothing changes. Then, in the 1880s, prospectors discover gold in the Yuruari River basin, deep in the disputed zone. The finds are extraordinary, some of the largest alluvial gold deposits in South America. Miners flood into the region. British settlers establish camps, extract ore, export it through British ports. The British government, seeing an opportunity, formally extends its claim. It announces that the Schomburgk Line is now official British territory. Then it goes further. It claims an additional 33,000 square miles beyond the original line, pushing the boundary even deeper into Venezuelan claimed land. For Venezuela, this is catastrophic. The British are not just taking jungle, they are threatening to take the Orinoco Delta, which would strangle Venezuela's economy. The government in Caracas severs diplomatic relations with Britain in 1887. It appeals to France, to Spain, to anyone who will listen. No one intervenes. No European power wants to offend London over a South American border. Venezuela has one option left. It must convince the United States to intervene. The Venezuelan government hires William Scruggs, a former American diplomat, as a lobbyist. Scruggs understands how Washington works. He writes a pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He prints thousands of copies and distributes them to every member of Congress, every major newspaper, every influential voice in the capital. The pamphlet is not subtle. It frames the border dispute as a test of American credibility. It argues that Britain is violating the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 declaration that European powers must not colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere. The pamphlet lands in Washington at exactly the right moment. President Grover Cleveland is struggling. The economy is in ruins. Unemployment is high. Strikes and riots disrupt cities across the country. Cleveland's political opponents accuse him of weakness, of failing to protect American interests. He needs a victory. He needs something that unites the public and distracts from domestic failure. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, reads Scruggs's pamphlet and sees an opportunity. Olney is a lawyer, a man who thinks in terms of precedent and principle. He looks at the Venezuela dispute and sees more than a border. He sees a test of whether the United States has any real authority in its own hemisphere. If Britain can simply redraw maps whenever it finds gold, then the Monroe Doctrine is meaningless. It means the United States is a spectator in its own backyard. In July 1895, Olney drafts a note to the British government. It is not a request, it is a demand. He writes that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and that its fiat is law in matters where it chooses to intervene. He insists that Britain submit the Venezuela border dispute to arbitration. He argues that refusal to arbitrate is an act of aggression. He demands a response. The note is aggressive in a way that diplomatic correspondence rarely is. It does not ask for negotiation, it asserts dominance. It tells the British Empire that in the Americas, the United States is the final authority. The note is sent to London. It arrives in late July. It is placed on Lord Salisbury's desk. Salisbury reads it, dismisses its arguments as legally unsound, and sets it aside. He is Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary both, a man who has managed crises in Egypt, in Afghanistan, in the Balkans. He does not believe the Americans are serious. He assumes this is political theater for domestic consumption. He does not reply. 4 months pass. In Washington, the silence from London becomes unbearable. Cleveland and Olney interpret the delay as contempt. They believe the British are deliberately ignoring them, treating the United States as unworthy of a response. The anger is not just political, it is personal. In late November, the British reply finally arrives. It is 2 separate notes, meticulously argued, dismissive in tone. Salisbury explains that the Monroe Doctrine is not international law. It is a unilateral American declaration with no legal standing. He states flatly that the doctrine does not apply to a boundary dispute between a European colony and a South American state. He refuses arbitration. He refuses to move the border. The message is clear. This is none of your business. Cleveland reads the notes and makes a decision. He will not negotiate further. He will escalate. On December 17, 1895, Cleveland sends a special message to Congress. He asks for funding to establish an American commission to investigate the border and determine the true boundary. That sounds reasonable, but then he adds that once the commission has decided where the line should be, it will be the duty of the United States to resist, by every means in its power, any British attempt to cross that line. By every means in its power. That is a threat of war. The reaction in the United States is immediate. Congress erupts in applause. Republicans and Democrats, who have been fighting bitterly, unite overnight. The press explodes with headlines. War with England appears on front pages across the country. Crowds gather in cities to sing patriotic songs. Irish Americans, who harbor deep resentment toward Britain, celebrate in the streets. Veterans of the Civil War, who remember British support for the Confederacy, call for vengeance. Militia units begin drilling. The country is seized by war fever. In London, the news arrives on December 18th. The British public is stunned. Most people have never heard of the Venezuela dispute. They open their newspapers to find that the President of the United States is threatening to go to war over a jungle border they cannot locate. The initial reaction is disbelief. Surely this is a mistake. Surely the Americans are bluffing. But as reports from the British ambassador in Washington arrive, the reality sets in. The Americans are not bluffing. Salisbury convenes his cabinet. The Admiralty begins running scenarios. What they discover is deeply unsettling. Yes, the Royal Navy is larger, but its ships are scattered across the globe, protecting trade routes from the Mediterranean to East Asia. To fight the United States, Britain would have to concentrate the fleet in the Atlantic, leaving the empire exposed elsewhere. And even then, the math is grim. The United States is uninvadable. Britain's army is small, designed for colonial policing, not continental war. Canada, with its vast undefended border, would be overrun within weeks. The Americans have industrial capacity that Britain cannot match in a prolonged conflict. They can build ships, produce steel, mobilize manpower faster than British factories. A war with the United States would not be a quick colonial campaign. It would be total war against a nation with limitless resources. But the most immediate threat is not military. It is financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war triggers a panic. British investors hold billions of dollars in American railroad bonds and industrial stocks. They begin selling. The market crashes. On what becomes known as Black Friday, liquidity drains from the London financial markets. The City of London sends a clear message to the government. A war with America will destroy us financially. Salisbury and his cabinet stare at the reports. They realize they are trapped. They have underestimated the Americans. They have assumed that British naval superiority was enough to deter any challenge. Now they understand that fighting the United States would be catastrophic, not because Britain would lose on the battlefield, but because the cost of victory would be too high. It would leave Britain vulnerable everywhere else. And then, on January 2nd, 1896, news arrives from South Africa that changes everything. A British colonial administrator named Leander Starr Jameson has led an unauthorized raid into the Transvaal, an independent Boer republic. The raid is a disaster. Jameson and his men are captured and humiliated. This alone is embarrassing. But then the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, sends a telegram to the Boer president, congratulating him on defeating the British without outside help. The implication is clear. Germany is willing to challenge Britain in Africa. The Kruger telegram hits London like a bomb. The British public, which has been focused on the American threat, spins around in fury. The newspapers that were screaming about war with the United States now scream about Germany. The anger toward Washington evaporates. The focus shifts to Berlin. For Salisbury, this is salvation. The German threat is real. The American threat, by comparison, is manageable. Britain cannot afford to be enemies with both. The choice becomes obvious. Salisbury signals to Washington that Britain is willing to talk. The negotiations are quiet. conducted through diplomatic channels. In February 1896, Britain agrees to submit the Venezuela border dispute to arbitration. They accept the American Commission. They accept the premise that the United States has a legitimate interest in the matter. This is the blink. After months of refusing, Britain surrenders. To save face, they insist on a few conditions. Settlers who have lived in the disputed zone for 50 years will be allowed to stay, regardless of where the line is drawn. The Americans agree. It is a face-saving gesture, but everyone understands what has happened. The Monroe Doctrine has been enforced. The United States has demanded that Britain submit, and Britain has submitted. The arbitration tribunal meets in Paris in 1899. It consists of British judges, American judges acting on behalf of Venezuela, and a neutral Russian diplomat. When the decision is announced, it awards Britain most of the disputed territory. The Schomburg Line is largely upheld. The gold mines remain in British hands. But the specific location of the border does not matter. What matters is the precedent. Britain has acknowledged that it cannot act unilaterally in the Americas without American approval. It has acknowledged that Washington has veto power over European actions in the Western Hemisphere. This marks the beginning of what historians call the Great Rapprochement, the strategic reconciliation between Britain and the United States. The British ruling class, shaken by the crisis, reassesses its global position. They look at the rise of Germany in Europe, the expansion of Russia in Asia, the industrial might of the United States. They realize they cannot fight everyone. They must prioritize. They decide that the United States is the one power they cannot defeat. Therefore, they must befriend it. This is not sentiment. It is survival. Over the next decade, Britain systematically liquidates its strategic presence in the Western Hemisphere, handing assets to the United States piece by piece. In 1901, Britain signs the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, giving the United States exclusive rights to build and control the Panama Canal. For 50 years, Britain had insisted on joint control of any Central American canal. Now, they simply give it away. They ask for nothing in return. The Royal Navy withdraws from the Caribbean. The North America and West Indies Squadron, which has patrolled the region for 2 centuries, is recalled to home waters to face the German fleet. British garrisons are reduced. Bases are hollowed out. Britain demilitarizes its border with the United States. This creates a vacuum. The United States fills it immediately. In 1898, 3 years after the Venezuela Crisis, the United States launches the Spanish-American War. They seize Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. It is blatant imperial expansion. Britain does not protest. In fact, Britain is the only European power that supports the United States. British diplomats keep France and Germany from intervening. The British press cheers the American victory. Britain is outsourcing hemispheric security to Washington. In 1902, when Britain and Germany send gunboats to blockade Venezuela over unpaid debts, President Theodore Roosevelt issues a warning. He states that the United States will act as the international police power in the Western Hemisphere. If Latin American countries misbehave, the United States will intervene so that Europe does not have to. Britain immediately withdraws its ships. The British Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, publicly states that Britain welcomes American influence in the Americas. In 7 years, Britain has gone from threatening war over a border to inviting the United States to police an entire continent. The consequences of this shift define the 20th century. By avoiding war in 1895 and cultivating American friendship, Britain secures the ally that will save it from annihilation. When World War I breaks out in 1914, Britain is financially exhausted within 2 years. It is American loans, American industry, and eventually American troops that keep Britain in the fight. If the Venezuela crisis had ended differently, if the two nations had remained enemies, the United States might have stayed neutral. The British Empire might have collapsed in 1917. Instead, Britain survives, but it survives as a diminished power. The Venezuela crisis is the moment the torch passes. It is not a ceremony, it is a confrontation. The British Empire looks at the United States and sees its own future, a nation with more steel, more coal, more people, more money, and it makes the rational choice to step aside. For the British ruling class, this is psychologically devastating. They begin to see themselves not as masters of the world, but as Greeks to the American Romans, wiser, older, guiding the younger power. It is a comforting myth. It helps them accept decline. For Venezuela, the result is bitter. They are saved from British expansion, but they fall under American dominance. The United States will control their politics, their oil industry, their foreign policy for the next century. They learn that the Monroe Doctrine is not designed to protect Latin America from imperialism. It is designed to ensure that the only imperialism allowed is American. Today, the border between Guyana and Venezuela remains disputed. The jungle is still there, dense and green. The gold mines still operate. The line drawn through the trees in 1899 is still contested, but the real border, the one that matters, was drawn in 1895. It is the line between the 19th century and the 20th. It is the place where the British Empire stopped expanding and started retreating. It is the place where the United States learned it could give orders and the world would obey. The Venezuela crisis proves that the most significant wars are the ones never fought. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot. But by losing gracefully, it gained the alliance that allowed it to survive the next 40 years. It was a humiliating retreat. It was also the smartest decision the British Empire ever made. They lost a continent, they kept their existence, and in the ruthless calculus of empire, survival is the only victory that matters. The jungle border remains, but the world it exists in was redrawn in those 6 months between July 1895 and February 1896. The crisis passes. The precedent remains. Power does not always transfer through conquest. Sometimes it transfers through a telegram, a threat, and a quiet decision made in a room where no one is watching. That is how empires end, not with fire, with ink. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from.